Hi, everybody. We are live. I'm on with Robert Monarch, the author of Human-in-the-Loop Machine Learning, and I'm Keith McCormick from Cloud Factory. And if you've seen these events, I just like to jump right in. So we're going to start with questions here in just a second. I do want to mention that we love questions. The interactive Q&A is a really fun part of doing this, but we have a lot of kind of level setting and kind of interesting things to talk about. So we'll probably be about half past the hour when I start monitoring for chat. So what you can do now is tell us who you are and where you're from, because if you're familiar with StreamYard as a platform, we see each other, we don't see you. The only way that you can tell us that you're out there is comments. So let's jump right in. So Robert, thanks of course for joining us. I usually don't like to start with just definitions, but there's something about human-in-the-loop that I think we should talk about. And that is that I think that most people are probably quite familiar with human-in-the-loop and creating a training data set, through human annotation. But could you help us kind of broaden the landscape a little bit? What are some other aspects of human-in-the-loop that maybe don't include in their sense of what human-in-the-loop can be?
Yeah, absolutely. So and first of all, thanks for having me here today. It's great to be able to chat, and I look forward to everybody's questions. So obviously, creating training data is one of the main, if not the biggest, areas in which humans can engage with AI, and especially for people watching this show, you'd be familiar with areas like quality control for human annotation. There's a lot of important aspects that go into human-in-the-loop systems outside of that. So for one, knowing which data to annotate. So given a very large pool of data, identifying the most important piece of information to put in front of humans to create the training data. So that's a process known as active learning. And then increasingly, we're seeing a big trend towards AI supporting human processes. So rather than thinking about the end goal being a purely automated process that you're creating training data for, you're trying to automate or semi-automate some of the processes that a person undertakes in their day-to-day tasks. So when you have a system like that, whether it's something as simple as autocomplete, which is kind of human-in-the-loop technology that you've all, I'm sure, used at one point or another, to maybe something more sophisticated, like helping a medical professional interpret an X-ray, then you have to consider a lot of human-computer interaction and user experience principles, so that the human and machine intelligence can be combined in the most effective way.
Yeah, that last one I'm really fascinated with. In fact, the last three guests in the series were all some aspect of the theme of exception processing, and that was often, the thing when the model is struggling. What do you do? How do you involve the human, possibly to improve the model, possibly to route unclear cases to a human, and so on. So fascinating topic. Also, the feedback loop that you were hinting at. In search, I know that you've talked about that, before, and is in the book. We may circle back to that, at some point. So again, a little bit of level setting, because we have a lot to cover, and want to greet Marcus joining us and some other folks joining us here. So again, that's a great use of comments at the moment, is to kind of tell us who's out there. So before we get into some of the more technical aspects, I want to circle back to active learning at some point. Let's talk a little bit about the human-in-the-loop marketplace. Who's doing this? Obviously, there'd be some companies that be doing this in-house. What have you seen out there in terms of this ecosystem that is starting to, build up around human-in-the-loop?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's three kinds of workforces that you'll see in this ecosystem, and I often find that the perception about which is the most frequent is completely reverse order from the actuality. So by far the most frequent use case for human-in-the-loop machine learning is by companies building this technology, organizations building this technology in-house. So they have existing human processes, and they are looking for ways to automate or semi-automate some of these processes. And shout out to Marcus, who just joined us and does exactly this in the e-commerce space.
Yeah.
Then there may be a choice that if you're building this out within your organization, whether you're building these technologies yourself, whether you're licensing those technologies, or some combination. And that by far makes up most of what you could consider the workforce for creating training data. Most training data is created by people directly employed by the organization that will use those models and the software that utilizes those models. The second largest workforce and the fastest growing workforce would be one with Cloud Factory, where you have dedicated outsourced contractors. Typically, these are people who will be receiving fair pay. They have guaranteed employment, independent of the contract that you're taking with them, and they can be trained so that even if they're not familiar with the domain, after spending many months looking at the data and working on a task, that they can become experts. And it's because of that last reason, that the ability for people to gain domain expertise in long-term engagements. That's why this is the fastest growing type of engagement. Then the third and final is crowdsourced workers. So these are people who are paid per task, and will often move quickly between different tasks, often not working on any long enough to become experts. So that's the three workforces: in-house, outsourced, and crowdsourced. And crowdsourced workforces make up like a tiny amount, like a fraction of 1% of the total amount of work that goes into modern deployed machine learning platforms. However, if you look at the academic literature, it's reversed. The majority of that literature is focused on crowdsourced workers. And it's certainly very important to think about quality control and for working conditions for crowdsourced workers. All of that research should exist. It's just that it has certainly been way more focused when I think more attention on top of that could be paid to the other kinds of engagements.
Yeah, there's another aspect to that you've already hinted at it, but that I really want to circle back to, is that you can kind of think of the three in a slightly different way. It would reclassify them a little bit, but it's kind of like you have crowd, human in the loop, and expert in the loop. And you were hinting at this a little bit because it's really interesting, where it makes sense to have a dedicated annotation person who's become expert through repeated exposure to the task, as opposed to, let's say, a medical student, let's say, or something like that. So that will certainly be something that I want to circle back from, because there's a quote from your book. In fact, I'm a pretty spontaneous guy. I may actually hit that now because it's kind of a nice segue given what we just said. So first, by the way, as someone that's written technical books myself, I have to mention something that really impresses me about the book. I don't know how many people have seen the book, so this may feel like a disconnect to the audience. But what's amazing to me is that the book passes what I call the airplane test. I've written a lot of books, as you did, that have code or have some kind of step in there. But most books that, when they transition to the code and the really detailed technical steps that you cover really very thoroughly, you lose the narrative. So if you're simply reading it and you're away from your computer at the moment, most books fail to keep that narrative, but your book totally does. And that really impressed me, because I know how hard that is to do. You can simply read it and skip over the PyTorch, if at the moment you're not sitting and working, and it still absolutely has this almost story arc to it. And it's very difficult to tell technical stuff through story. So
I appreciate that. And that was a deliberate effort on my part. So I'm glad it landed. I certainly want this book to still be really useful for someone who maybe doesn't care about the implementation side, or it's not their job. But it has to manage an annotation workforce, or manage a broader human in the loop project.
Well, that
I hadn't heard the phrase airplane test before. I like that.
I've co-authored most of my technical books, and that's the phrase that he and I use. By the way, I want to greet a couple of other folks. If I'm looking in strange directions, it's because I've got multiple monitors, going here.
No
I also
worries.
want to welcome Suman is here, and Prabhat has joined us. As is typically the case, we have folks joining from all different places. It's always fun to add geography, by the way, when you say hi to us. But to circle back to that point that we just made, that just might seem like this kind of interesting little tidbit to share from one technical author to another. But you identified the reason why I think it's so important, and why I think of the airplane metaphor, is that it could be a director or VP level that is in between meetings, but they're gonna, this is an important process for them, but they're not going to be sitting down and doing PyTorch, but yet you want to appeal to that audience too, because there's a lot of strategy that's involved here. In fact, you use a phrase that I think is really powerful. You talk about the science of annotation, rather than annotation being this kind of passive, uninteresting task that you kind of get out of the way and then the real work begins. You have some, powerful examples in the book that if organizations don't take the annotation seriously, they run into a lot of trouble when they get to the modeling, phase. But while we're still on it, let me read this little quote to everybody so that you can respond. And it's really on this issue of expertise, because I think it's such an interesting aspect of this. So you write, finally, not all outsourced workers should be considered low skilled. For example, if an annotator has been working on annotation for autonomous vehicles for several years, then they're highly skilled. If the company is new to autonomous vehicles, then those outsourced workers can also be a valuable source of expertise. They have intuitions about what to label. And as someone that's lived in the structured data world most of my career, I have all kinds of tricks up my sleeve on how to find outliers, but I don't experience outliers the way an annotator would over months of years of being exposed to the data. And I'm sure you would agree, modelers often drop the ball when it comes to handling outliers. So I guess I've hit you with two questions now that you have to answer, which is to comment a bit on the kind of expertise that an annotator develops over time, and then kind of this notion about how that gives them a particular point of view on outliers.
Yeah. And so I think, outliers or like other kinds of trends in the data, if not outliers that might have been otherwise overlooked. I think there's a lot that you gain just from looking at the data. And as a data scientist building models, you should do this too. So my book forces the reader to annotate data before the first model builds. So that is baked into the code in the open source examples. Looking at the data for a period of time is obviously something that an annotator does. There are a few better ways to get a feel for exactly what what's in the data, in addition to being able to understand the edge cases, which might not be immediately intuitive. An annotator will also have a good intuition about what's missing. Some obvious examples in NLP would be like language representation, what languages are there or what's not, but also variation within a language, or if one certain demographic or often a small privileged demographic is overrepresented in the data, then annotators will have a good intuition about that. Even before you go in and apply more statistical methods to try and evaluate and measure those potential biases and imbalances in the data. With that intuition, then comes a lot of expertise. And this is something I've seen repeatedly when I've been on the side of creating training data for different companies. So I've seen it with self-driving car companies, with e-commerce companies, with companies doing things like named entity extraction. Once they come to the data labelers for a problem that they're tackling for the first time, these annotators have been doing this for, in some cases, every major company with a similar kind of problem for 10 years. And so I've seen some great cases where, for example, a very prominent finance media company in New York flew its data scientists out to where the team of annotators were based in India to sit with those annotators because the annotators had insights into their data about Wall Street that they couldn't get in New York. And so I love that this is an option for people building data models, that there is expertise in these annotation workforces. What I love even more is that it means that these annotation workforces should be being viewed as highly skilled individuals who play a very key role in the global information economy.
Yeah, I have 2 or 3 follow-ups to this because it's just, to me, such a fascinating issue. In fact, one of the things that really excited me about joining Cloud Factory myself when I was hearing some of these things is it resonated with my experience. Sometimes if you feel that you have to seek out a particular subject matter expertise, you might seek out that expertise in an opportunistic fashion wherever you can find it. Like, let's say, medical students, or it could even be PhD in agronomy or something like that, whatever the expertise might be. But if you only have access to those SMEs for a couple of weeks or a few weeks, perhaps during med school, summer vacation, or something like that, there's a lot of gearing up to the task. So you think that you're bringing in, this perfect expertise, but actually you could actually find that someone that's been assigned that task for a year could outperform someone that arrives with this, book knowledge. But then again, there's perhaps an underestimating of how much is involved in the annotation task itself.
Yeah, there is, and I guess I simplified things by talking about 3 different kinds of workforces. In that, you will often want multiple workforces. So you certainly may have someone who is more qualified and maybe has more experience, but that is more from a more limited subject matter expert pool of people. Certainly not a pool big enough that could annotate all your data. But then those people could help design the task, write the guidelines, create reference examples to become gold examples to measure the accuracy of the broader workforce. So there are ways that you can combine workforces like that. And then in addition, you might find that someone who's been doing this particular task for years, certainly might not have, and to extend the medical example, might not have the full training for the breadth of work that a physician or other healthcare professional might do, but nonetheless might be better at this one particular task. And then even if they're not, there are good ways of implementing quality control so that the resulting training data that you get is better in terms of accuracy and representation than the training data that you would get from any one individual, including a subject matter expert, even if none of the individual annotators are necessarily at that level of accuracy or representation.
I love what you just said about mixing and matching resources in that way. In fact, something similar had come up in conversation with a colleague earlier this week. And so I want to, I have 2 follow-up questions. I tend to ask a lot of follow-up questions. People that have seen these events know that that's my style. But what I want to do is I want to acknowledge, and it looks like a couple of additional folks have joined us, but I want to acknowledge those of you that participated in our LinkedIn poll, and thank you for that, because Robert and I were both surprised that one category got the lion's share of the votes. There were 4 categories, and it got almost half, and that was on managing human in the loop. And it was one of the categories, so I knew that was going to get some votes, but perhaps didn't think that was going to be the winner. So I want to frame my follow-up questions, through that lens. Could you perhaps elaborate a little bit on the mix and match example where maybe a subject matter expert, again, perhaps PhD, medical degree, something like that, was involved in a POC stage, and then what's happening is that SME then becomes, let's say, like a team lead or something like that, and then you have to kind of transition from the SME to something more scalable. Let me add just a little bit more to that. One of the things, again, that impressed me about the narrative that you had in the book is that you outline in the very beginning that you're going to start with straightforward examples and then get to advanced annotation. And I think there are probably some readers that when they first encounter that in the very beginning are surprised that there is such a thing, because if you're not bringing a very sophisticated lens to what annotation is, you probably are surprised that there is such a thing as advanced annotation. But one of the things that makes it advanced is when you're using multiple techniques concurrently, right?
Right.
So do you have an example that you can think of kind of off the top of your head where you have the subject matter experts coming in kind of in the design phase and then scaling it to more a managed annotation workforce? That's just would be very interesting to me if you had one.
Yeah, absolutely. So I can talk to that. But I guess first I'd like to address, as you pointed out, what is a misconception about annotation and people thinking it's only soft skills, which are still vital. To get good quality control requires fairly sophisticated math. So if you have multiple people, even on a simple labeling task, who might disagree on what the label is, there's no kind of like shortcut heuristic which will always give you the best way to resolve that disagreement. It's something that requires modeling and converging models in itself. So I like to say that most machine learning is just a bunch of high school math taped together in a really fancy way. It's just it's kind of like linear algebra and regression, networked to the limits of what hardware will do at a given point in time, and that really is covering most of machine learning. That's not to downgrade it. The way that people are taping things together is really clever, but that's kind of all it is. Whereas annotation is a bunch of first-year college math taped together in in various ways. So it actually uses more sophisticated statistical fundamentals. Annotation uses more sophisticated statistical fundamentals than machine learning, and it comes out of, in particular, the social sciences from a broad range of disciplines. Education, so people who are trying to tackle the problem of when you have different people grading exams, how do you account for the variation between the different graders? It comes out of economics, people with a limited subjective view on the world, how do we resolve the differences between their subjective opinions such that we don't perpetuate bias? Long-standing studies across a range of disciplines, including psychology, sociology, and linguistics, looking at potential imbalances in data, which have their basis in societal imbalances and power differences, which can result in differences in data that need to be accounted for historically for things like surveys, but in this case for things like training data to power machine learning. So there is a rich body of statistical and mathematical work that goes into the task of creating good training data, more so than into machine learning itself. So that's really overlooked. And
let me pause you for,
go ahead.
I was just going to say, I want to get to the management piece because that was kind of the question we're on.
Yeah,
However, you've raised such an important issue. I want to stay on this issue that you've raised for another couple of minutes because
Sure.
you raised this in a book and I think it's fascinating. So let me first just kind of agree with you that I think most people, if they were thinking, oh wow, I've got to take, maybe they're trying to get some kind of a master's degree or something, they're going to take a course in annotation, which you point out in the book would be hard to find, right? But let's say they were going to attend a seminar or something like that on annotation, or they were going to attend a seminar, a topic that I've taught 1,000 times, decision trees. I think you convincingly make the point in the book that they would have to brush up on math to watch you do an all-day workshop on annotation, more so than they'd have to brush up on the math they would need for me to do an all-day presentation on decision trees. Because the math and decision trees you could fit on a 3x5 card, right. and there's more going on with annotation. Yeah, so I've always suspected that you could have folks that are even PhD level machine learning data science types that underestimate what they're in for with annotation and probably go into their first annotation project somewhat naive about what's involved. And you seem to identify, the same phenomenon. One of the things that you explain about is that it's just not taught in academic settings. I don't disagree with that theory, certainly, but I have another one, and I'm just curious to get your feedback on this. Do you think part of it is that the generation of faculty that would be teaching in data science programs now probably grew up building models on structured data more than they grew up on models, using unstructured data? because, in the world of my work with clients over the years, a lot of it's been, insurance fraud or something like that. That's largely you build the
Right.
model on the structured data and you bring in the unstructured data as things allow. But if you are doing ag tech or NLP or a lot of the areas that you work in, you've been pretty much in the unstructured world your whole life. Do you think that's part of it as well? Is that people, there's a lot of people out there that are more familiar with structured data?
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that before. I bet it does play a part that structured data, and in particular in academic settings, popular data sets that everybody uses, meant that people haven't had to think about the annotation problem. That latter part is certainly true even for unstructured data. So for I'd say more than 95% of NLP papers published, so papers looking at unstructured data, those papers are published on data sets that probably hadn't changed in many years. So there was a training set, there was an evaluation data set. And so the majority of work in NLP is more than the majority, like more than 95%, keeps the data constant and then tests different algorithms against that data. And I mean, you can look at the roots of this from when it was harder to collect data. You needed a standards organization to publish it for you, and then this bias perpetuates. Whereas it's very easy to get funding for a graduate student or a postdoc to experiment with different algorithms, but it's hard for researchers to get funding to create new data sets. And so that perpetuates this bias, and that makes its way into industry too.
So in other words, it wouldn't be crazy to say that somebody could be 5 years into their career, maybe 30-ish type, really true expert, but that has spent 80 or 90% of their career training hours building algorithms on these kind of legacy data sets. And that could, at that stage in their career, feel that they're taking on like a new project, or maybe they're being a project lead for the first time and could be having to deal with data annotation truly for the first time, because they've been trained and even designed algorithms and even designed prototypes on these pre-existing data sets.
Yeah, absolutely. I hopefully not 5 years. I would avoid hiring someone who had a career of 5 years in the industry and never had to worry about training data.
But they could get for grad school.
Yeah, but absolutely, like straight out of school, this is one of the most common experiences that someone in a data science role will have, that they didn't learn anything about the data side of machine learning, and then that will become the majority of the work that they do. And so this is one of the ways that the focus purely on algorithms, whether it's undergraduate or even graduate school, means that there's a disconnect between academia and industry. And some of that attitude can sometimes pervade as well. So annotation, especially by people new to data science, is viewed as not as valued as training models. That attitude doesn't really exist in experienced people. I think most people who have worked a long time in data science appreciate the complexities and how much fun it can be to work on the data side. But certainly with fresh graduates, they get a rude awakening. And hopefully my book is plugging that gap in enabling people in that position to ramp up on their skills quickly, and appreciate that this is a fun, exciting, and very important piece of machine learning to work on.
Yeah, again, I just think it's fascinating because there could be a CTO or CDO or the like out there that would not anticipate that might be a risk of a newly minted PhD, given the extensive experience that a PhD would have. So it's just kind of
absolutely, yeah. Especially that technical leader didn't necessarily come from a machine learning background, that might not be aware of this disconnect. And I've seen this a few times. I've seen companies new to machine learning hire a bunch of really smart recent graduates in machine learning, and then not be able to solve the data problem because that skill set wasn't among them. So yeah, if you're a technical leader in a company without a background in machine learning, and you have spare time to read a 400-page book, then I recommend I recommend my text for you to.
Well, I'll give a specific plug for another aspect of your book that I was impressed with. I'm a fan of sidebars. I gather that you are as well. I'm thinking about the industry anecdotes that you pulled and get colleagues to contribute. And the reason that I'm a fan of them is because, as you know, a lot of times you'll have a topic that comes up and it doesn't necessarily fit the explicit narrative of the chapter, but it's a point that's so important to make. So I don't know how you decided to do the sidebars or decided to do these interviews. I don't know if it was an idea you had from the beginning or if it evolved, but there would be a lot of editors that would push back gently on that and say, wow, we can't. This seems like a digression. And then next thing you know, you have these sidebars, but I found them to be very valuable. And there was, one about each chapter where in some cases, names that folks would recognize, talking about things that went wrong or things that were interesting or things that they remembered. And I thought that was a valuable thing that you added in there.
I appreciate that. Yeah. My editor was really supportive of that. It wasn't something that, is typical. So to give listeners background, I interviewed 11 people, and for all of them that had a similar profile. At some point in their career, they had been responsible for building machine learning models, including the data side of those models, and they had founded a company. So these are people who have really taken on some really hard data annotation tasks. These include people who build the Spacey library, people who have specifically tried to work in AI supporting children on the autism spectrum, especially from underrepresented communities, so children of color, typically being overlooked also by the medical industry, healthcare industry, that is. So people that worked on really, really tough and important problems, which you as data scientists would be facing to some degree, and also people who have founded companies, because I think all of each one of these 11 people are role models. And I would like readers to understand the path that, understanding the data side of machine learning, really having that rounded picture of everything it takes to ship a successful product. It's also the skill set that can make you a good leader.
Well, exactly. I keep on thinking of these directors, VPs, and C-levels that at first might even, when the physical copy comes out in June, I'm sure you're looking at that or flipping through it and they see the pie chart and they think, wow, maybe this isn't for me. But I think you really have reached out to that audience, because all of the practitioners out there that are leading the annotation teams want their bosses and even their bosses' bosses to have some understanding of what's going on. Yeah, one of the anecdotes that jumped out at me was Jia Li. Hope I'm saying her name properly.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Was part of ImageNet, and now is applying in healthcare. And it was a brief anecdote, but talking a bit about the difference between these academic based algorithms, research data sets, and then creating a data set. As a founder of a of a company. So it's been several minutes.
Her example is great. Jao and I were PhD students at the same time. So she was completing her PhD in computer vision, was one of the creators of ImageNet at Stanford at the same time that I was doing a PhD in NLP there. And, followed each other's career, and is now doing incredible work at a company applying a lot of really important use cases, more than classifying images in ImageNet, now looking to have positive impact in patient outcomes with good monitoring technology. I'm not sure how much I can talk about exactly what that company is doing, but as Jazz says in her anecdote, making that leap from academic type data sets to real data sets is a big one.
Yeah. No, very, very interesting stuff. So we've been dancing around this issue. So let's nail it. I also want to kind of shout out to our audience here to start thinking about Q&A, because I'm going to really start paying attention to that in the comments within about the next 5 minutes or so. But we have 2 or 3 remaining topics in our checklist here. So circling back to management, why don't we take the disaster response example, that you talk about in the book. Right. But from a particular point of view, if you don't mind, the folks that went with that answer in the poll was managing human in the loop. So let's say that, by the way, I would love for you to say a couple of minutes about the backstory, about how you got involved in that and what the nature of the data was, because I think it was very interesting. But there's a particular aspect of it that you mentioned in the book that I think that I want to pick up on, which is this notion that eventually you're going to have a very granular solution, but you might simply begin with an initial screen of whether the phrase is relevant or not relevant.
Yeah.
And that resonated with me for 2 reasons. One is that most of my data science career, I've been doing binary classification, right? Because that's the classic place. It's where you start very often, especially with structured data, or especially if it's going to be like deployed, like commercial banking, finance type stuff. But the other reason is I think almost everybody on the planet has seen the clip from Silicon Valley with the hot dog, not hot dog. But that may not be the image that comes to mind when they're thinking about something like NLP. They're probably thinking more like diagramming sentences or something like that. So if you could kind of walk through what the problem was, how you would start it, and why you might start with the binary classification before doing the more granular. That's a lot to put on your plate, but as best you can.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is a good general principle for approaching annotation, is to break the task down into its subtasks and think about if you could have that as a workflow. So even if you're doing information extraction, so like labeling the locations or the names or certain keywords in a piece of text, having a first step to say whether or not this piece of text is even relevant for that task. And then you can think about whether or not that is the same person in 2 steps, or is this a different task, maybe even a completely different workforce, because that first task requires maybe less domain knowledge, less skills.
So I've glanced at the data, but almost no one else will have. Unless
sure, I'll give the background there.
So how did you get involved in disaster response, and what was the nature of this data?
Yeah, so I obviously I work as a machine learning professional, but I've been a disaster responder for a long time as well. So before I moved here to Silicon Valley, I was working post-conflict development for the UN in West Africa. I continued to work as a disaster responder. So following earthquake in Haiti in 2010, I managed the first step in a text-based emergency response system, where I found and managed about 2,000 members of the Haitian diaspora to do real-time translation and classification of emergency messages from Haitian Creole to English. Worked in similar environments following floods in Pakistan, various places during the Arab Spring. Worked in epidemic tracking for a while, and at the start of COVID-19, helped a number of organizations working on the response. A lot of what I've learned as a disaster responder in some of the most critical information are learnings and skills and knowledge that I've now brought to industry, and now used for basically every large tech company here in Silicon Valley.
Quick clarification.
So that's just
go ahead. What was the forum? What was the forum in which this information was? With these social media, chats or news feeds, or where was it coming from?
Yeah, so in the book it's just news headlines, but I've worked in all of the above. Social media tends not to be that useful in disaster response, and has a lot of privacy concerns. So we advise people to stay away from public social media and look for private channels of communication. So again, one area that's just been over-researched and falsely presented as being an important avenue of information for disaster response. A lot of work with text messaging in particular, especially like 10 years ago, when most people only had access to a feature phone in the world, and text messaging was the most common form of communication in the world at that time. It might still be. And so you're dealing with short messages, no exact location attached. There's a lot of processing needed to translate and make sense of those. In the book, where it's not looking at the time critical component of this, it's considering trying to classify news headlines and into whether they're disaster response related or not. And actually, you don't even need to buy the book to do this. The open source code available with it has this data set. And the first step is a very simple binary classification task. Is this news headline related to disaster response or not? And just within this really simple example, it shows you how to approach it. So like I mentioned earlier, you're forced to look at some headlines and annotate data yourself before any model will build. And this should give you an intuition for what's in the headlines. What's the language coverage? These headlines are from an Australian media organization. So what might be the distribution and biases inherent in what an Australian news agency would choose to write about? So typically countries that are geographically or politically close to Australia. Will there be biases in countries in certain parts of the world? Only certain kinds of news gets reported about those countries. And right through to the kind of things you need to think about when setting up a labeling task. So man-made disasters like wars are considered part of the ontology and the way this is set up. But then that brings interesting questions about how bias could be perpetuated, because someone not affiliated with any army who commits a terrorist act based on their ethnicity and religion might be considered part of a war of terror in some cases and not in other cases. And the media will perpetuate that bias. And so then you have a decision as the person annotating this data to decide, okay, am I annotating what this story says is disaster related or not? Or am I taking a different towards more objective view and try not to perpetuate this bias against certain ethnicities, nationalities, and religions? And so even in a very simple binary classification task, like, is this disaster related or not? It gives great examples of all these really hard problems that you need to face, even just when you're coming to set up your task, even before you're thinking about all the stats that need to go into selecting which data you annotate.
So to summarize, if someone tried to classify, let's say, topic or category too early, all of the problems that you just identified are still there. They're just hidden under the complexity of the problem. Yeah, the notion that you really have to iterate through simple to more complex really came through. We're starting to get some really fantastic questions because, as you know, just a few minutes ago, I said, okay, everybody, time for questions. So we've gotten them. You can actually click on comments in StreamYard and kind of, see them as well. But the first of the recent batch to come through is posted under my colleague's Amanda's name, but it was from R. Hobbs. I'm just going to read it explicitly because you will be kind of interpreting, where they're coming from with this. What are thoughts on how human in the loop for data annotation should track annotation reviews? As human review and correct data, they may change answers. How to track the pedigree of ground truth?
Yeah. So ground truth data is really, really tough to get right. So so in this context, ground truth data is the set of known answers against which you want to judge the accuracy of your broader workforce. So you typically give some or all of your ground truth answers to your entire workforce in order to evaluate the accuracy of each individual person. However, yes, you should expect that there could be errors in your ground truth data, or you might have tasks or even like individual items where there are multiple correct answers, where it's inherently subjective, or it's like inherently multi-label response, and you haven't set up the task that way. And so, yeah, you should definitely have mechanisms, and I think all the major annotation platforms do this. Have mechanisms for an annotator to indicate that they thought they had the answer right, even though they were told that they had it wrong by ground truth. So in general, you will need to apply all the quality control metrics. So inter-annotator agreement, review on your ground truth data to ensure that the errors are as small as possible. You will need to consider, is a random sample of items right for ground truth, or do you want to oversample based on labels or other external demographics to ensure it's fairer and closer to the accuracy that you want to meet downstream? And in which case you might want to track both kinds of accuracy. And then
asking for a rule of thumb is always tough because I know that whenever I'm asked that question, the answer is always it depends, right? But I'll take that risk. In your experience, about how much of the data do you like to have annotated twice to have sufficient inter-rater data to get at those kinds of issues? Is there a rule of thumb that generally applies?
It's tough. Like it's a depends answer, and I hate to give that. But
yeah.
So one of the things I point out in my book, that if you have 3 or fewer raters, or 3 or fewer annotators, as I try to call them, if you're fairly confident that one is right, I think it's about 70% or more confident, rather than trying to average or aggregate, you're better off just trust in the rater that you're most confident with. And this is a mathematical equation that you can work out. So certainly the taking a majority view is not necessarily the right thing to do. And this also will go into the diversity of your workforce. So if you have like subjective data and you want a variety of answers, if you have people who will agree with each other all the time, you're going to have really high agreement, but they'll all agree when they have the same error. And this is one of the things that you can evaluate how much this occurs with ground truth data. That's why you want both kinds of approaches. So your ideal situation actually is to have a diverse workforce that will have lower agreement. So at the very least, when there's disagreement, either you're giving that to more people or sending that to your subject matter expert. So yeah, it's the right number will depend on the diversity of your workforce, complexity of your task, and how confident you can be in the most confident person. And then beyond just using raters, you might have confidence resulting from your model as well, right? So there are different ways that if your model can predict this task, maybe you only need one more rater. Your model is already 99% confident. It's like 98% accurate when it's that confident, and confirmation from one rater is enough. So that's really going to be task dependent.
Well, again, it hints at, and I'd be taking us down a rabbit hole if I'm not careful here, and we have 3 really great questions that I want to get to, but it seems to hint back at the importance of good strategy, good management, and a mixture of resources where you might have that expert in the loop and a scalable human-in-the-loop workforce, but with this inter-rater reliability and these double checks and this feedback, all part of the solution.
Yeah, that's right. And I'd add one thing to that, which is also your model can determine what interface you use. So let's say you have a really time-consuming task like semantic segmentation. It might take you an hour to divide up this screen into the different categories. If you have a very confident model, you could have that be pre-populated and have the annotator correct where the errors are. And so instead of having 2 annotators take an hour each, 2 hours total, it might be enough that it's 5 minutes of someone to review, make sure it's correct, make it a couple of small edits. So you have a lot of if the main thing you're optimizing for is the amount of time that someone that your workforce is putting in, then you have a lot of options of integrating machine learning to make it more efficient, other than just thinking about the number of annotators.
Yep. Tarek has an interesting question here. With regards to annotation, we can set labels for images and point out whether labeling is correct or wrong. But how can we get to where machines understand why or how they were wrong? This gets almost to XAI type territory here. But how do you create a feedback? I guess Tarek is getting at, how do you create a feedback loop between model error back to human in the loop? It's kind of a complex question.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, so I mean, for one, you ask, right? Like, like if the model is wrong and a human is looking at it, the human is there to give feedback about why. I've seen a couple of examples. A good one The classic one, let's say it's a text classification task, is you have a person highlight which words or phrases should have contributed to the correct classification. Another more recent approach, which I think is really interesting, is asking someone to make the minimum number of edits to change the classification of something. So like an example, like something basic like sentiment analysis might be putting not in front of something to reverse the polarity of it. And making those small edits and having them go into the training data is a way for your model to basically understand which features were important and which weren't, which might have been the errata words that just happen to correlate with a given category, but really shouldn't have been the focus.
That's really interesting because it reminds me of this kind of geeky thing, but I bet you've heard of it. When you're looking at misspellings, I think it's levenstein distance is what it's called. Is the number of the number of characters you have to change one word into another. And you're saying that you can do that same kind of measurement at the sentence level, and that gives you some notion of how easily a meaning could be changed, right?
Yeah, that's right. And so with I believe most of the time in the recent literature, this is called like adversarial examples created by humans. So what's and often like in kind of a fun academic way, it starts with, okay, here is a correctly classified a sentence. Make the minimal number of edits. You as a human make the minimal number of edits that you think will be needed to reverse the meaning.
Yeah. Fantastic.
So,
okay.
Fun example.
Couple of things that have been on my list right here from the beginning. So let's start to one that I know that you're passionate about, jumped out in the book, and I know that Mark Sears, our founder, is passionate about as well, which is when if somebody is looking for a managed workforce, you're explicit in the book about how that workforce is going to be more successful if they're in a stable work situation, they're being well paid. Could you comment a little bit on that, on kind of the ethics of the human in the loop marketplace?
Yeah, and so this I just consistently found, and I've spoken about at length. The best workforce for a task is the one who is secure in their jobs and is paid fairly. The ethical approach to outsourcing work for annotation is also the best approach for a business. There certainly are exceptions to this, and they're all built on the back of business practices which are inherently exploitative, and which is therefore extended to the annotation workforces. And so this is, again, one of the biases that people might carry from graduate school, where there's a focus on crowdsourcing platforms and it's paid per task, and you have a small budget and you're trying to get the most out of it. And there's a lot of scammers on those kind of platforms as well. And the good workers pay the price of the scammers. I don't know any large company that is relying on a crowdsourced annotation model. Like I said at the start of this interview, the fastest growing workforces are external contractors with fairly paid individuals. And as I also say in the book, even if you're not the person in your organization directly working with outsourced workforces, if you're a data scientist working in machine learning, you have a duty of care to everybody contributing to the models that you are creating. And you should be inquiring about the workforces that are building your training data and whether they have fair working conditions and fair pay, given the cost of living and laws of the place where those workforces are based.
Yeah. No, very powerful stuff. Okay, I have one remaining question that I'm personally super excited about that I've been meaning to get to, but a little bit of housekeeping, because I'm sure my colleagues will want to put this in comments. We've been doing these events about once a month, and next month I'm going to be talking to Osama Fayyad, who's kind of famous for a couple of things. He helped coin the phrase knowledge discovery in databases, and kind of like co-chaired the first of those conferences that's been going on forever.
Oh, I love the KDD conferences. I've spoken at many of them.
So like he and Gregory, who runs the KD Nuggets website, and one other gentleman kind of wrote this influential paper like in the mid 90s and did the, I guess it was like a workshop that became much bigger than a workshop.
That's right. Yeah. I've been around long enough to remember that.
Yeah. So he was the first co-chair, and he's going to be our guest next month, which is really exciting. And he's been in Silicon Valley all this time. He started out at Jet Propulsion Laboratories right after his PhD work, which is really interesting because he has that kind of, not academic exactly, but science, working with, the scientists at JPL, and then has gone on to found a number of companies and so on. He's just a super interesting guy. So I just want to mention that to everybody. And registration is already open for that. So here's the final question, and the clock has got to run out of us, but I've been wanting to ask this.
Sure.
Deep learning in sample size is so different than, an old school technique like, logistic regression or, decision trees, where you're told you have to have a certain number of cases per parameter. And that's largely kind of out the window. It's changed. But what I gather from your book is that it's more about the diversity of the data set than the grand total. But if you could, and you made a comment to me, offline that there's a lot of misunderstanding around sample size and deep learning. So I know it's a big topic to end on. We only have 2 or 3 minutes, but your thoughts on that?
Every few years, someone comes up with a method that means that annotation is obsolete. That's been true for 20 years, and it'll be true for the next 20 years. In
what sense? Because I wasn't coming at it from that angle. In what sense do people try to make the annotation go away?
They're trying to semi-automate. That they use use model predictions. Recently, like really interesting approaches to using transfer learning to give you a head start, and that certainly reduces, but by a linear amount, the amount of annotations you use. And then we use a lot of transfer learning techniques in the book as well, as part of the annotation process. However, if you want broad representation in your training data, you're not going to get that with a handful of labeled examples and transferred from a non-representative model. Furthermore, all these studies are academic studies that already have the evaluation and validation data. In the real world, if you're annotating data for the first time, you still need to create your evaluation data sets in order to know how accurate your model is. You need your validation data sets in order to tune your machine learning model on. So if you're going to the trouble of engaging a workforce and quality control metrics to create your evaluation data, why wouldn't you just also extend just the workforce piece to create more training data? You put a lot of time into creating the guidelines and thinking about the evaluation data, and so that's what happens in industry.
Am I Robert? Am I oversimplifying if I put it this way? Because this is kind of what seems to come through in the book, is that you make a best guess as to how much data that you need. You do the proper diagnostics, inter-rater, but quality control, but a whole bunch of other things as well, and then you might conclude that you need more, and you iterate again. I mean, is that a vast oversimplification, or at a high level?
I have a broad outline in the book where it's basically orders of magnitude to go from signal to a usable model to something you can deploy to state of the art. And it's like more or less an order of magnitude each time. Exactly what that order of magnitude is will be task specific.
Yeah.
That gives you like a rough idea to begin with, and then because you have these fixed costs of creating guidelines and quality control metrics for evaluation data, you can work out the not that more substantial variable cost of also creating the training data.
Well, and if you're a startup, you don't have 3 orders of magnitude more than you budgeted. There's definitely exciting ways you can bootstrap with very little data, which I cover in the book as well. So if you're getting out of proof of concept, yes, lots of fun things you can do really quickly. Absolutely fabulous stuff. Very much enjoyed it. And as is always the case with these events, there's always more to talk about than we have time. But I had a fantastic time. I hope you did as well. And I hope everybody in attendance did. If you missed the first half or something like that, please follow Robert, follow Manning for news about the book. Follow us here at Cloud Factory. You can even follow me individually if you like, because I'm always talking about these events each month. And there you have it. There's more to come. So, Robert, thanks again so much.
Thanks, Keith, and thanks everyone for your questions.
Okay, cheers.